In current DC Comics, Superman is happily married to Lois Lane and has a son named John Kent. He is a husband and father, and that development has severely enriched the character and his stories and has generally been positively received by fans ever since it happened. But the journey towards the status quo was a long, extremely convoluted route filled with some of the most baffling decisions DC has ever made. I thought it would be pretty fun to dig into how this status quo came to be and what resulted in DC Comics finally making it main universe canon despite being against it for a long time. Now let's dig into it. Superman and Lois Lane got married in 1996 in a special issue titled Superman the Wedding Album. This development was partly inspired by a desire to have Superman and Lois Lane get married at the same time as their TV counterparts in the Lois and Clark show, and they succeeded at that. Even though it was slightly rushed, it still felt like a satisfying long overdue development because of the years of history between Clark and Lois, and their wedding quickly became an important development and status quo change for Superman comics and one of the most monumental superhero weddings of all time. For a decade after that, Superman and Lois Lane remained married. Their stories were able to use them well, further proving that marriage does not have to be the final frontier for superheroes, even though there were certain people at DC who really did not like the marriage. Hell, there was even a pitch in 2000, just 4 years after the marriage, which pitched the idea of removing the marriage from continuity. The pitch came up with the idea of Lois and Clark completely forgetting their marriage and lives together, and Lois forgetting that Clark Kent is Superman. This story could have been the One More Day of Superman comics before One More Day was ever a thing, but thankfully it never. In 2006, DC Comics decided to shake things up, and in Action Comics 844, Clark and Lois adopted a kid and named him Chris Kent. Much like Superman, this kid fell from the sky onto Earth and seemed to be a Kryptonian, and Superman took this opportunity to do what his parents did for him. Later, it would be revealed that this kid is the biological son of General Zod and his wife Ursa, which severely complicated things. Despite everything, Chris was raised by Clark and Lois and became a hero, and continuously rejected his biological parents and what they stood for. He even became Nightwing when Dick Grayson abandoned it to become Batman. This was the official adopted son of Clark and Lois, and technically their first child in the main universe comics. In 2011, DC decided to reboot the universe after the Flashpoint storyline. This allowed them to do what they had wanted to do for a long time, and they finally removed the marriage between Clark Kent and Lois Lane. Before going into how that affected Superman comics, I want to talk about Chris a little bit more. Since the marriage was gone, it would not make sense for Clark and Lois to have adopted a kid, and so much like 90% of legacy characters, Chris Kent was wiped from existence. He finally made his return around 2017 during the DC Rebirth initiative, but this ended up being a new version of Chris Kent who was now raised only by his biological parents and was going by his birth name Lozard, with no memory of Clark Kent and Lois Lane and no history with them as well. This proved to be the final death knell for the character of Chris Kent, who has been replaced by a different version of himself, and it is unlikely that he will ever return in any form because of another major development that forever changed Superman comics. When the New 52 started, Clark Kent was young and single again. Lois Lane was dating a random guy. Years of stories and development had been completely wiped away for a so-called fresh start. This Clark and Lois were barely friends and had no significant relationship with each other. They were pretty much strangers. This Clark Kent would go on to date Wonder Woman in one of the most controversial stories of the era. This Lois Lane was so ruthless that she did not even mind writing a story that revealed that Clark Kent was Superman after she accidentally found out. While the younger, brash and New 52 version of Superman did have his fans, majority of Superman fans were vocally against this version and constantly complained about missing the older, experienced version of the character who had a relationship with Lois Lane, and the New 52 Superman books were generally lackluster as well, with no clear direction to speak of. Something needed to change. In 2013, during the Convergence event, we finally got the return of the pre-Flashpoint married versions of Clark Kent and Lois Lane. The story also featured the birth of their son, Jonathan Samuel Kent, in the Batcave, with Flashpoint's Batman serving as the operating doctor. This was initially just meant to be a simple miniseries that provided closure to the characters, but DC saw the positive response and decided to try out a very complicated idea. DC brought this version of Superman and Lois Lane, the older versions, to the main universe, which was the New 52 at that time, and retconned it so that he had been there for years in the New 52 universe and had been operating in the shadows so that nobody would realize the existence of another Superman and Lois Lane in the same universe. They got their own series titled Lois and Clark, with John Kent now being 10 years old and slowly getting his powers. This series was extremely well received by fans, while the quality of New 52 Superman stories were continuously dwindling. DC decided to make a bold decision, and they decided to kill off the New 52 Superman just in time for the beginning of the Rebirth Initiative. And months into the Rebirth Initiative, the New 52 version of Lois Lane was also killed off, which sets the stage for the older version of Clark and Lois to step into the spotlight. The Rebirth storyline firmly brought back the married Superman as the main Superman of the DC universe, and Clark being a father was a major focus, with the very first storyline of the new Superman series being a father son adventure titled The Son of Superman. Along with Lois Lane, this family dynamic brought something extremely new and refreshing to the world of Superman comics, and fans loved it. The decision to make the older versions the main versions of the DC universe was warmly received by fans, and John Kent became the new Superboy and became a widely popular, universally loved addition to the comics, and even decided to get his own comic series eventually, which was titled Super Sense, along with the Robin named Damian Wayne. At this time, DC decided to double down on it, and in the Superman Reborn storyline, they merged the New 52 and pre Flashpoint versions and rewrote continuity so that there had always been just one Superman and restored the history within the DC universe. Now, John Kent was born in the Fortress of Solitude under the watchful eyes of his parents, Batman, and Wonder Woman. This solidified that DC had finally given in and had understood that Superman being a father and husband enriched the character, and that the fan base loved it, and that it was high time they started embracing it instead of running away. It's 2023 now, and the marriage is still going strong, and Superman's still a father in the main continuity, and the chances of that changing anytime soon seems very unlikely, and I'm very glad about that. Of course, there have been bad stories and weird developments, such as the unnecessary aging up of John Kent and Superman's secret identity being revealed to the world again by Superman himself this time, and the almost immediate backtracking they did to make sure that the secret identity was back in the box. But DC has stopped blaming the marriage for these problems and have treated the iconic Clark and Lois relationship with respect, much to the pleasure of fans. So even if the stories get a bit bad or weird or something else, fans still had something to look forward to with respect to the relationship and the main dynamic of the comics. The road to Superman becoming a husband and father was a long, complicated one, but it was ultimately worth it. It was the inevitable natural evolution for Clark and Lois, and getting married and becoming parents has only enriched their characters and their relationship dynamic, and I hope DC never tries to remove it from continuity ever again.